You're going to speak for a minute and then I'll come and join you.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah, hi. So, thought we'd just share a bit about the nature of the challenge we face in Bristol, because sometimes it feels that when we're in political discussions, we're not dealing with the same raw material. So we try to put it to people like this. Bristol is 42 square miles, that's it. We're not getting any more land. Our population is 472,000 people at the moment. When I was elected in 2016, it was 460,000. So we are the fastest growing core city. At the moment, we have 20,000 people on our housing waiting list, right, on that population. 1,300 households in temporary accommodation. By 2050, we anticipate our population to be at 550,000. So that's nearly another 80,000 people in the next 27 years. Within that 42 square miles, on top of an existing housing crisis, right? And just one figure to bear in mind, we are the least affordable city outside London. Our private rents in the last 10 years have gone up 52%, wages have gone up 24%. So we have to meet the needs of that population, right? That sits on top of a city of entrenched inequalities. So we have areas like Clifton, 100% of teenagers go on to higher education. Hartcliffe, about 11%, right? So the inequalities in Bristol are mapped onto patterns of race, class, and those are obviously mapped onto geography within the city as well. And beneath the surface, some of that played out during the Colston statue incidents over the last few years. So we have to take those challenges on. But we have to do that in the context of a climate and ecological emergency. So how do we tackle those inequalities? How do we generate decent jobs? How do we deliver the homes within those 42 square miles while protecting land for nature and space for nature, while also minimizing the price the planet will pay for us meeting the needs of that growing population and tackling those inequalities? That is the dilemma of Bristol, and I'd suggest that's the dilemma facing a lot of, well, most city leaders around the world, and I meet them quite often. We have a £15 billion economy. We have to find a way of securing that economy so that we generate jobs, make sure people can make a living, but also find a way of making sure that the model of that economic development is one that is inclusive. And by inclusive, I don't mean we generate a whole bunch of wealth and then we do a couple of equalities projects off the back end of it and try and get a couple of jobs for some brown kids from the inner city. In the very nature of the way the economy works, how do we get an economy that the RSA would say is regenerative, restorative, tackles inequality, supports the recovery of nature, takes carbon out of our life systems? So that's our challenge. We grapple with it. The other thing I would just say very quickly is there are no solutions that come without a price to be paid. And I think that's a problem that we have today on the world of Twitter. People think that there are clean solutions. There are no solutions. There are unintended consequences. There are negative consequences to good solutions for some people. Thank you.
Thank you, Marvin. You laid out the dynamics and the demographics to some extent that create and define Bristol as a dynamic but complex city. This is a sustainability conference. We're bringing together ideas, but first we have to understand the reality. Why, in your view, is climate justice a race and class issue?
Because again, one of the things I've been pointing out a lot recently is the perversity of climate change is that it's the poorest and most marginalized who get hit first and hardest by the consequences of climate change. Mm-hmm. The internal perversity is it's also those groups who are most vulnerable to paying a financial penalty or falling on or being structured out of economic opportunity as we go through the restructuring of the economy. Mm-hmm. And I don't think sometimes people always grapple with that. So during my election, I remember I won't say which party, but they would say things like, well, you could pay a few pennies more to have organic, just pay a few pennies more. It was a statement they made. Yeah. They had no concept of a world in which some people literally don't have a few pennies more. Yeah. I was at an event before we launched our Clean Air Zone. And they were saying to someone, an academic actually from the university who's quite well known in the environmental movement in Bristol, was saying, this is the most important issue in the city. 300 people a year die because of clean air. So I said, well, that's true, but for some people, the number one existential threat is being stabbed.
Yep.
She said to me, yeah, but how many people get stabbed? I thought, what a condescending, disparaging, privileged statement. Because actually for some people, even if they don't get stabbed, it is a near and present danger every day. And we've had a number of murders in Bristol over the last few weeks. And so that kind of self-centered, one-dimensional view of how we prioritize issues is, I think, is something that the environmental movement has to break out of if it is going to build the democratic base to deliver the change we need at the scale and pace we need to deliver it.
So how does the environmental movement break out of that centric view?
Well, I'm not. I generally in my discussions, I like to ask questions as well, which some journalists don't like, because I'll say, "Well, how do you say we should?" You know, because I don't think I've got all the answers. But I'll throw a few things out there. One is, it is an absolute priority of the environmental movement to become more inclusive.
Yep.
Let's not lose sight of the possibility that progressive political movements can recreate the very social and political hierarchies they blame for the state of the world. And claim to be fighting against. So dominated by middle-class, white, privately educated, Oxbridge-educated people, who then talk down to people. And when I was living in DC, I remember someone saying to an activist, it is okay to live out the values. So it's okay to live in a way that counters the values you claim to be fighting against. So it's making the movement that's much more inclusive is number one. And I think taking poverty seriously is another one. You know, there's a very throwaway line where there's no jobs on a dead planet. Therefore, don't worry about jobs, just focus on the planet. Well, that's fine if having a job isn't the difference between your children eating and not eating. So having much more space for a wider range of views to come in, I think it'd be two of those things I would say would be a very important priority.
And let me flip that question round then. If your your priorities on a daily basis are ones of immediate safety, if you describe the threat of or the risk as a young person of street violence, what can our communities do for ourselves to elevate our attention and engagement with environmental concerns when there are so many other pressing issues?
Well, I would say it pivots on one of the same points I'd make is that if we want people to be thinking about existential threats that really begin to bite, and I know they're biting now, but I mean really begin to bite in 10, 15 years, you have to create the mental, economic space for people to be able to think longer term. If your number one issue is, my children are going to eat tomorrow, do you know what? I'll roll the die and take my chances on 15 years' time. Got to eat today. So one is that has to be an element of environmental movement. But within our own communities, and by that I guess we mean black, brown, poor, working class communities, one is I think it's important that we do the work to show people that environmental threats impact our communities first and foremost. That's not saying that we take away their attention from the immediate threats, but it is to say, look, even if you haven't got the space, just so you're aware, right? Things like migration. I work on something called the Mayor's Migration Council. There are 11 mayors from around the world. Mayor of Zurich, Montreal, Amman, Freetown, and I'm one of those mayors. From the moment we set up the MMC, we said that we would have a relationship with C40, which is a global network of city leaders on climate change. But we said we should never have a conversation about migration without talking about climate change, and we should never talk about climate change without talking about migration. 4 years ago, when MMC was starting up, we were talking about 150 million climate-driven migrants. And actually, we're changing the phrasing, really. We don't want to talk about climate migration. We're talking about climate displacement. The idea is not voluntary, right? Now we're talking about 1.2 billion by 2050. Those are our people. And one of the conversations I had in our community, as it were, is think about this little constellation of events. People's economic circumstances being thrown into question by the state of the economy today. So people in receiving communities, as it were, in the global north, feeling insecure. 1.2 billion, primarily black and brown people, being displaced by climate from the global south, and predatory politicians,
Right.
Farage, Trump, stitching that together.
You're talking about the small boats rhetoric.
Yeah. The threat to the very nature of our democratic system in the global north is there, clear and present danger. That is not only bad for everyone, but it's particularly bad for people who look like me, you, and our children.
So I'm really glad you mentioned the global context. Climate, race, migration. Let's bring it back to cities. What role do cities like Bristol have then in engaging with this debate and making it making positive decisions for our future?
Yeah, little plug. I gave a TED talk on this last year. Can push up my viewers. So I did actually give a TED in Vancouver last year on this. Look, so increasingly, I think people who are serious about climate change are beginning to look to city leaders. All right? Faith in COP is waning. For all the years they've been meeting, we've just found that national governments just can't seem to get out the blocks. They can't seem to do the deals that need to be done. Now, that's a function of a number of things. I think it's a function of the nature of national government, which is very zero-sum, boundaries, thinking that they can have an interest within their geography without an interest in someone else's geography. But I think it's also a function of the cumbersome national structures. But if you look at the city level, cities can move, right? We've got actual places. So the Secretary General of the United Nations said about 4 or 5 years ago, climate change is going to be won or lost in cities. Now, if you think about it, it's an urban world. By 2050, 2/3 of the world will live in cities. If you decarbonize the world's cities, you solve the bulk of the problem. And look at what we've got in cities, right? We've got things that we can take advantage of. We've got density. Density creates an incredible opportunity to increase our efficiency. If we increase our efficiency, it takes less resource to sustain our lives. Efficiency on energy use, water use, movement. So this, where we are right now, is going to be one of the biggest regeneration schemes in Europe. We've got this ball rolling. 10,000 homes, 22,000 jobs. 10,000 homes within walking distance of the city centre, within walking distance of the train station. There'll be residential, retail, entertainment. So this can be an actual kind of example of, of that efficient living. Brownfield site, so we're not taking up greenfield, right? So we're protecting land for nature.
Yeah.
We're bringing the water course back into play. That's what cities can do. The challenge is, the world is awash with money, but mayors can't get hold of that money.
Yeah. And the things that you described is in a sense where the rubber hits the road, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about challenges. Your efforts to deliver this in Bristol have not been entirely straightforward. What can you just talk us through some of the pressures that you've experienced and perhaps why Bristolians in the end decided to get rid of the mayoralty?
So I'm going to put one out there, by the way, again, which is a challenge to activism. So I'm writing about this at the moment. Some activism, because the world is complicated, take a simplistic route. And by that, I mean this. We are actually trying to decarbonize the economy. Right, trying to decarbonize Bristol. But it's not easy. There's a phrase that one councillor, and I won't say which one, but used in full council that said, all it takes for Bristol to decarbonize is political will. And what a silly thing to say. If you're serious about climate, you would never say something as silly as that. It takes political will and about £16 billion, right? Political will and planning, housing delivery, right? Alignment with national government. If all it takes is political will to do stuff, I'd have ended racism, sexism, I'd have zero school exclusions. It takes so much more than that. And what I mean by that is, the danger of activism is when it begins to look for popularity, and so just bounces off of government all the time. So so rather than saying, do you know what, I'm in a different group to this, but I can see we have alignment at this point, it just wants to have the fight to make itself look good. That is one of the biggest threats because it fragments the voice where it doesn't need to be fragmented, and it takes attention away from the real blockage on delivery. Our challenge on delivery in Bristol is one of finance. Local government, our budget, 80% of our budget in Bristol is consumed by children, services, and adult care. That leaves just 20% of our spend to do that forward thinking, have the expertise on decarbonisation to get the deals done. We've just done a £1 billion deal on decarbonising Bristol's energy system. But that all takes money to get that done. Money is scarce resource. Why people got rid of the mayoral system? I mean, I'll peel the layers back on that. I think it was a councillor issue.
Yeah.
I think it was a really bad move. I wasn't going to run again anyway. I've said that, so it wasn't. Well, people may have voted to get rid of me, but if it was about me, it was a mistake. I think it was like a Mexit, to be honest.
Yeah. Final question from me, and then we've got to crack on, and we'll come to you guys for one. We talked about race. We've talked about that from a citizen perspective. Race in leadership as well. How do you think that impacted your time as mayor of this great city?
So look, as a black man, mixed race man, the irony is that even in progressive circles, if you talk about race, people will use the term, oh, you're playing a race card.
And people tend to talk about Bristol being a progressive city.
Yeah, well, it's not, though. The thing is, I think sometimes the most dangerous place to talk about race is in progressive circles.
Right.
Martin Luther King made this point in his letter from Birmingham jail. He said, our biggest impediment in the walk towards freedom is not the white citizens' council or Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is much more dangerous and frustrating than absolute opposition from people of ill will. Malcolm X made the same point. At least in the South, they're honest with me. Right? You come to the liberal democratic North, you still got opposition, but they're anti-segregation.
They told you what they think.
Yeah, so listen, I'm in a room, and but I'm going to be honest with you. So rather than me listing race, and I will tell you race has been a factor in my leadership, even in progressive circles, I would ask this question I asked of the people who tore the statue down. Do you think there's an area of life that race does not play a role? If you say yes, good for you, not good for us. If you say no, then you'd be open to the possibility that my occupation of a leadership role in Bristol has not abstracted me from the experiences I have in this country as a black mixed race man. And I have to grapple with those experiences daily.